So let's talk a little bit about photosynthesis. This is basically just going to be a quick overview of the process, as well as talking about why it's so important. So let's just start off by talking about why plants do photosynthesis. Well, unlike us, who we have to eat our food to get our energy and our matter, plants are really awesome because they can actually make their own food in their bodies. So not just cooking it on the stove or putting it in the microwave, they can actually make the food in their body, which is awesome. And they do it through this process called photosynthesis. So we're going to write out the actual equation for this. And you can kind of see in this picture what the plant needs in order to do photosynthesis and what is made or released due to the process. So let's go ahead and start out. Let me get my pen going. One thing that is needed by the plant, obviously for photosynthesis, you can think of sunlight, is the sun. So this sunlight is going to actually provide the energy that's needed for this process. And it's dependent on the sun. So plants would not be able to do this without the sun. It's really cool. They can use the sun to make food. It's awesome. So that's one thing they need. You can see here they also need carbon dioxide, CO2, from the air. So that's another thing that's needed. And excuse my handwriting because I write terribly with this pen. And the last thing that they need is water. They take in water through roots or whatever other system they have, depending on the plant that it is. But they need these three things in order to do photosynthesis: sunlight, CO2, and water. Okay? And light is what provides the energy for this process. Again, the whole purpose of this is to make food. And for plants, the food is in the form of sugar. More specifically, they make glucose. But this is the whole purpose, is to make this sugar. Another thing that's made through this process, which is great for us, is oxygen. And we need that to breathe. And the plants don't really make this for themselves. It's just kind of a byproduct. Really, the whole point of photosynthesis is to make sugar. But through the process, oxygen is also made or created. And this works for us too because it provides oxygen that we need to breathe. So this is the basic equation here for photosynthesis. These three things are needed. You need light, carbon dioxide, and water. And plants use those three things to make sugars, which is their food, and oxygen. So that's the basic equation for photosynthesis that you need to know. So why is it important? And let me move my screen up so you can see it a little better. And I'm going to kind of read this and we're going to talk about it. So take a deep breath and think a plant. Did you know that every cell in your body needs oxygen? Without it, cells would die off, and so would you. When you breathe, you inhale oxygen. So every time we breathe, we're inhaling oxygen. When we breathe out, we're exhaling carbon dioxide. That's another colorless, odorless gas. So take a deep breath through your nose. As you do, oxygen enters your body. Now exhale from your mouth. You've just puffed carbon dioxide into the air. Through photosynthesis, plants consume that carbon dioxide. They release oxygen so you can enjoy another breath. So we're kind of giving things back and forth to each other. Plants give off oxygen and we breathe that in. We breathe in that oxygen and we use it and we create carbon dioxide. And we don't want carbon dioxide in our body, so we breathe it out. Then plants can then take that carbon dioxide and they breathe it into their body to use for photosynthesis, and then they breathe back out the oxygen. So it's this cycle where we're just giving gases back and forth, and it's a really dependent kind of cycle. We depend on each other for these gases. Please pass the sun. Sometimes scientists believe that photosynthesis is the planet's most important process. Without it, people and animals would have no food. Earth would lack building materials for homes and businesses. Living things thrive on the sun's energy. Through photosynthesis, plants capture energy from the sun and convert it in a chemical reaction. Through the food chain, they pass it along. Discover why photosynthesis is the key to survival. Okay, photosynthesis, as said here, is believed to be one of the most important processes on Earth. And I kind of agree with this. because plants and other organisms, I'm sorry, not animals. Animals cannot do photosynthesis, but some bacteria can, um, some protists can. So there's certain organisms that can do photosynthesis. They can make their own food. And they use energy from the sun to do this. And that is the very beginning of the food chain. Because without plants, there would not be anything to eat, because they're the beginning of energy. They can take the energy from the sun and make their own food. Then certain organisms eat plants, and other organisms eat other organisms that eat plants, and so on and so on. So the base of the food chain starts with organisms that can do photosynthesis. So it's extremely important. Without it, there would be no food, as is talked about right here. There would be no food. We would have no building materials. We get a lot of our building materials from plants. Think about the oxygen that it provides. So photosynthesis is extremely important for life on Earth. And as said here, many scientists think that photosynthesis is the key to the survival of most of the food chain. It is. We wouldn't have a food chain without photosynthesis. It's the very beginning of the food chain, and it all starts with the sun. It's pretty amazing to think about that all the energy running through our bodies originally came from the sun and was passed through the food chain to us. So all the energy in life starts with the sun. It's a pretty cool concept to think about. All right, so let's talk a little bit more about the equation. We've learned that photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide, water, and light. Those are the three things that are needed to make glucose and also release oxygen. Okay? I'm not as worried for you to memorize these numbers. I want you more to know what is used in the equation and what is released in the equation. However, you do need to know how to balance an equation. You do need to be able to add up what's on one side of the equation and the reactants and add up the numbers on the other side, and they must be balanced. But you don't need to memorize these numbers. I want you to understand what comes in and what goes out of photosynthesis. Okay? I also want you to understand that this is happening in the leaves. The leaves are really where photosynthesis kind of happens in the plants. They're the food factories, okay? And leaves are shaped certain ways to actually collect sunlight. You know, they're flat. Plants can actually reach towards the sun. You can actually do an experiment where you can move light in different places around a plant, and the plant will move towards the light. It reaches towards the light. So plants can actually move like that. You won't be able to see it in like a swoop like you would with a human arm or something. But if you look at a plant and then hours later look at it again, you'll see that it has moved, okay? It's a slow process, but they do it because they're trying to get those leaves to collect as much light as possible. Those leaves are like little solar panels that just collect that light. So leaves are really, really important for the photosynthetic process, all right? And that's where you get the light. Water is going to come from the soil. The roots will suck up the water. And then carbon dioxide is floating around all of us in the air. So plants can just take in that CO2. Okay, so remember that the leaves are kind of where the action's happening. Another thing you need to understand is that all of this is happening in an organelle in the cell called chloroplasts. The reason we cannot do photosynthesis is because our cells do not have chloroplasts, but plant cells do. And they're really kind of the solar panels within the cells of the leaves. And they contain this pigment called chlorophyll. And really the chlorophyll is what can kind of soak in that sunlight. Okay, it's what can soak in that light energy. And chlorophyll is actually what gives plants their green color. Because it's a pigment that actually reflects the color green, so you see green when you look at a plant. So here are kind of the three ways, again, just to go over it, that the plants get what they need to do photosynthesis. The chloroplasts in the leaves are what brings in or soaks in the energy from the sun, which is solar energy. Plants get water from the ground through their roots. And then you get carbon dioxide taken in through something. And let me see if we talk about that. We will talk about that next, actually. And these things called stomata, which are kind of these openings or pores in the leaves that allow carbon dioxide to come through. So let's kind of move into that and talk about leaves a little more. Photosynthesis takes place in leaves. Here's some things about leaves that help it do what it needs to do. They're typically broad and flat, which helps them really kind of soak in as much sun as possible, as well as the wide, thin surface. And here's what I talked about. They actually can grow towards sunlight to kind of capture as much light as possible. And so they're little food factories because they have like all these cells in it, and those cells have chloroplasts, which again we do not have. That's why we can't do photosynthesis. And now let's talk about stomata. They're kind of like lungs and sweat glands. All right, and here's kind of a picture, and let me move the screen down a little bit so you can see that, where you can see these kind of pores, and they can open and close. Okay, and when they're open, they're similar to lungs in which they can take in and release air. So this is where CO2 can enter into the leaf. They're also kind of like sweat glands for us because water can pass in and out. Okay, so water is released from here as well. So water and air can pass in and out of these stomata. And again, these things can close too. So in really dry conditions, plants don't want to let out too much water. They'll get dehydrated, so they actually have to clamp shut. But really, I want you to understand that this is where plants can get CO2. CO2 can enter through these things when it's needed for photosynthesis. Okay, so let's lastly just talk again about the importance of photosynthesis. And I've kind of already alluded to these things and talked about these things. Some say that, again, that it's the most important process on Earth. Why is that? Well, again, it's the primary source of food for all organisms. It's the beginning or the base of the food chain. Animals that eat plants are called herbivores. Okay, so we're considered herbivores. We eat salads and fruits and veggies and all that stuff. So we eat plants. And many organisms eat plants. They're the base of the food chain. Plants also provide oxygen for us. This process of photosynthesis results in the release of oxygen so that many organisms can breathe in oxygen. It also, on the other hand, uses carbon dioxide, because remember, that's one of the things that is needed to do photosynthesis. And if you remember, pollution releases too much CO2 in the air. There's such a thing in the air as too much CO2. Yes, we do need CO2 in the air because plants need it, but there is such a thing as too much of it. All right, and that's because we burn these fossil fuels, and you got these big power plants that do all this, and it releases all this CO2 into the air, which can be very toxic. And plants actually suck a bunch of that CO2 up because they use it for photosynthesis. So when we're cutting down all these trees, it's not a good thing because there aren't enough plants taking more of that CO2 out of the air. Okay, the more plants we have, the better, because they kind of clean the air for us by taking in all that extra CO2 that we don't need. All right, so there's kind of the importance of photosynthesis in a couple different ways.